Now, prior to your testimony today, have you had an opportunity to review a run sheet from May 6th of 2019 involving George Floyd?
Yes.
Do you recall all of those details off the top of your head now?
No.
All right. Now, in terms of your recollection of May 6th of 2019, were you summoned to the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes, precinct 4.
To attend to Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
Upon arriving at the 4th precinct, did you talk to Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
Did you learn information from Mr. Floyd about what he had consumed and the time frame he had consumed it in?
Yeah, it was quite hard to assess him. He was upset and confused. Some of the things he said were.
I'm going to straight Certainly. Did Mr. Floyd, were you able to learn that Mr. Floyd had consumed some narcotics that day?
Yes.
What did he tell you specifically about what narcotics he had taken and when he had taken them?
He told me that he had been taking multiple, like every 20 minutes, and it was a I don't remember if it was Oxy or Percocet, but it was a opioid base. It wasn't real consistent with his behavior. At that point, was real elevated and agitated.
No, you're gonna.
The last thing about agitation is stricken and down stop. You can just wait for the next one.
Thank you. He informed you he had taken some sort of an opioid every 20 minutes or something like that, right?
And then another one as the officer came up.
Okay, so he told you that he had taken a pill at the time the officers were apprehended.
Correct.
Did you do a physical assessment of Mr. Floyd at that time?
Yes.
Specifically, did you take his blood pressure?
Yes, I took a set of vitals.
Would you agree that your first vitals were taken at approximately 1:34 and 59 seconds?
I thought looking at the run sheet, I could have been for sure.
Would it refresh your recollection to review the run sheet?
Yes.
May I approach the witness room?
And the time here that 13:34 was the first recorded vital sign.
That reflected your recollection?
Yes. Did you hear that?
I know you can't time for the minute. If you need to refresh your memory with that, just let us know and we'll allow you to refresh your memory. But otherwise, testify your memory as best you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
At approximately 13:34, that's 1:34 p.m., agreed. He took his vitals, correct?
Correct.
And that would include his blood pressure at the time?
Yes.
And did you record what his blood pressure was at that time?
It was 216 over 160.
Did you ultimately make recommendations to transport Mr. Floyd to the hospital?
Based on that and other issues.
And ultimately, was he brought to the hospital?
Eventually.
I believe that's all I have, Your Honor.
No.
Morning. You provided treatment to George Floyd on May 6, 2019, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And you were concerned about his blood pressure at that time, correct?
That was one of the things.
And in the course of your treatment of him, he explained that his high blood pressure wasn't something new, right?
Initially, he denied medical issues, but then when I discovered his blood pressure, I specifically asked again, and he said yes, he had history of hypertension and had not been taking his medication.
And he said he hadn't been taking his blood pressure medication for months, correct?
Correct.
And he told you that he swallowed some pills, right?
Yes.
Approximately 7 Percocet, correct?
Documented, yeah, 7 to 9 every 20 minutes or so for a while.
And Percocet is a brand name, right?
Yes.
Is that oxycodone and acetaminophen?
Yes.
And it's used to treat pain, correct?
Correct.
You testified that it's an opioid, yes?
Correct.
So he told you that he had been taking those pills throughout the day, right?
Yes, and I asked him why. He said because he was addicted.
He told you he was addicted, and he responded to your questions about taking the pills, correct?
Correct.
And he was able to walk, correct?
Yes.
He was able to stand up,
Correct.
and you wanted him to go to the hospital, right?
Correct.
And he didn't feel like he wanted to go to the hospital, correct? He was resistant to going to the hospital, right?
I know he was real resistant to get on our bed. It was hard to tell exactly what he was upset about.
I'm going to object at this point.
I'm sorry.
Just with respect to going to the hospital,
Yeah.
I'm going to limit your question to the question I asked for that. He didn't want to go to the hospital, right?
I'll say yes.
It took some time to convince you to go to the hospital, correct? And you indicated that he told you he had been addicted to opioids, correct?
Correct.
And he'd been addicted to opioids at that point for a year and a half, right?
I'm not aware of that.
But he didn't feel like he needed to go to the hospital.
He didn't want to go with us at that point.
And you were referred to your run report, right? The record that you keep in terms of the treatment of patients. You see that up there, correct? And according to your run report, you documented that Mr. Floyd was alert, correct?
Yes.
And that he obeyed commands, correct?
Eventually.
That's what's in your report, right? Correct?
Correct.
And that he had an appropriate response to stimulation, yes?
Correct.
He wasn't nauseous or vomiting when you were treating him, right?
No.
His respiratory rate was normal, yes?
It was elevated at times.
You wrote respiratory effort normal in your report, correct?
At the beginning, yes. His effort was normal. Increased at times.
And throughout your documentation, you wrote respiratory effort normal, correct?
Correct.
At 1334, at 1409, at 1426. All those notes, you indicated that his respiratory effort was normal, correct?
Correct.
He was not in respiratory distress, correct?
No.
His blood oxygen level was normal, right?
Correct.
His pulse was normal, correct?
Yes.
His heart rhythm was regular or normal, right?
Correct.
His EKG was normal.
Correct.
He had a normal rhythm, the sinus rhythm, which is the rhythm of a normal, healthy heart, correct?
Correct.
And you indicated that you had been worried about high blood pressure for the possibility of a stroke, right?
Among other things, yes.
But he didn't have a stroke, right?
He didn't have any indications that he was picking up at the time.
He didn't have a stroke while you were with him.
No.
He was never given Narcan, correct?
Correct.
He didn't stop breathing.
No.
His heart didn't stop.
No.
He didn't go into cardiac arrest.
No.
He didn't go into a coma.
No.
And you took him to the hospital, correct?
Correct.
And he was monitored for 2 hours and released right after, right?
I don't know.
Nothing further.
Anything. Thank you. You may step down.
Yeah.
we're already through the first two witnesses of the defense, limited in what they can talk about and testify. We'll be talking more with my guests in a little while as they take a break to explain why the limitations were put on them.
5-minute break, which means it'll probably be 10. But let's go with 5 minutes for now.
And an official 5-minute break here, a lawyerly 5-minute break, the judge called it, so we'll head back to the trial once it resumes. This is live coverage of the trial of Derek Chauvin with the Washington Post. Let's go to my colleagues, Eugene Scott and Rhonda Colvin, joining me now. So Rhonda, very quick pace for these first two witnesses, all surrounding this incident in May 2019. We knew that this was discussed a lot with the lawyers before the jury ever even knew of this incident. So let's talk about what we did hear, and then we can talk about what we didn't hear and what they were dancing around the edges of. So, Rhonda, first of all, these two witnesses, the police officer and the EMT who then responded. So, let's go through what that body camera footage of Officer Scott Creighton showed, Rhonda.
Yeah, so this is from 2019, May of 2019, when George Floyd was pulled over by this officer who was the first witness, Officer Creighton. You see, he's approaching the car from his body cam. You can see him approaching the car. He's asking George Floyd to put his hands on the dash. Voices are raised. George Floyd is telling him, "Don't shoot me," and that's because a gun had been pulled. Creighton pulled his gun on George Floyd. You can see it a little bit in the frame. And they go back and forth a little bit. George Floyd is saying, "Don't shoot me." Creighton is saying, "I'm not. Obey what I'm saying." And then you can hear some of the other officers, too, yell into the car as well. So one of the reasons why this is a key part of evidence for the defense is they worked really hard and debated in earlier pretrial proceedings to get this in as admissible evidence. And they had to convince the judge that it was similar to the event with Derek Chauvin. So that's one of the reasons why we saw a lot of starts and stops, is because this piece of evidence, this video, was something that the judge said could only be used in very limited circumstances. But he said when he watched it, it was similar to what we saw with Derek Chauvin because of the medical response that came from Floyd after. We just heard from that EMT worker that he did have elevated blood pressure, and it seems as if he had some sort of anxiety as well. So that is why the judge wanted to allow it in. He said the jury should not be considering Floyd's behavior in that clip, but more so there should be a discussion about how this could be used in medical analysis to see how George Floyd reacted when approached by police. So that was one of the reasons I suspect we kept seeing the judge and the lawyers stop and start, reframe their questioning, is because this piece of evidence was not something that the judge initially wanted allowed, but had to be convinced that it was relevant to the case.
Yeah, let's go to Eugene for those guardrails that the judge put on this. Eugene very specifically telling the jury that they could be looking at what effect ingestion of opioids would have on George Floyd, but not as a character judgment, not to weigh in on sort of who he was or how he acted as a human being, Eugene. Talk to us about those guardrails and how effective can they really be?
It's doubtful that they could be incredibly effective. I mean, it's advice and it's perhaps warning, but you cannot control other people's biases and prejudices. And the reality is what this video shows is George Floyd being arrested at another time, having substances in his system at another time, and having a cop feel the need to respond to him so forcefully in language and in action that he pulls his gun on him. And so asking jurors to disconnect that from the incident that he was involved in that took his life, it's going to be difficult and certainly impossible for the judge to control, and at worst could end up showing that this is someone with a repeated history of negative interactions and behaviors that led to police officers to respond to him in aggressive, forceful ways at the risk of causing even more problems and leading us to where we are presently now.
Yeah, Eugene, definitely see why the defense would want to introduce this, right?
For all those reasons,
yeah.
Absolutely. It's certainly just not portray Floyd in a way consistently with how his brother and many other individuals who try to provide a more holistic perspective of him. This is just these are two incidents within a 12-month period where he was behaving so questionably that law enforcement officers had to interact with him. And when you consider that the defense's primary response was that Floyd, who he is and how he has behaved, has ultimately led to his death, you can see why they would ultimately want this to be shown, because it could ultimately benefit children.
Of course, Eugene, this gets us back to what you've written about and we've been talking about throughout this trial, which is that George Floyd is not on trial, right? And that there is a history in these cases of the defense, the police,